Welcome to Act Now. I'm Julianna Forlano. Thanks for watching today. We have a very special show for you. The anniversary of Occupy Wall Street is coming up, and people are talking. Today on the program, Jay Ponti, author and activist who is on the ground at Occupy LA. He has a new book out about how Occupy Wall Street led to the Bernie Revolution. And then on the second half of the show, Jay Ponti, our first guest, is going to be hosting Noam Chomsky. That's right. Noted activist, professor, linguist, and philosopher. Noam Chomsky is going to be on our program. Two activists talking to each other. It's not to be missed. Stay tuned. On September 17th, mainstream media outlets will reiterate their position that the Occupy Wall Street movement achieved nothing and was by and large a failure. Why? Because September 17th marks the 10-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, and the mainstream news doesn't want anyone to think that progressives did something important and are currently organizing and being effective, and that their viewers might want to get off the couch and get involved. Most folks outside the movement don't necessarily see how it continues to have a direct impact on politics and society today. Joining us on the program to discuss this, Jay Ponti, activist and founder of Be the Revolution. Jay was on the ground during the Occupy encampment period and is behind many successful actions. His new book, The Political Revolutionary's Handbook, not only gives an inside look into the organizing that launched the movement, but makes the case that the Occupy Wall Street network is directly responsible for the political rise and presidential bids of Senator Bernie Sanders. Jay, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, I'm so sorry. It's actually, the book is called Be the Revolution, How the Bernie Sanders Movement and How Occupy Wall Street and the Bernie Sanders Movement Reshaped American Politics. Well, it started out as the Political Revolutionary's Handbook. And then the publisher, Strong Arm Press, who are absolute movement allies, said that
they strong-armed you into changing the title.
Yeah, well, in a good way. It was a good suggestion because it was 650 pages, and they're like, maybe as a first book, no one wants to read a 650-page book on organizing. I said that's a fair point. So,
okay, that is a fair point, but I have to say this book that I was lucky enough to get a pre-review copy of, because it's not out yet, is a huge page turner. I mean, I personally thought it was amazing.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, you got one of the very first copies, and we're still working on it. We're still editing it, but I'm glad you liked it.
I mean, it really puts all the pieces together for people who weren't there. And even those of us who were there don't necessarily know exactly what happened on the floor when they were voting for, to try to get some of Bernie's platforms onto Hillary's platform, or just, and you really pointed out some of the important players, which I thought was really, really important because they obviously get neglected by the mainstream media.
Yeah, this is a love letter to the movement. And, that was very much part of the purpose of the book, was to make it probably the hardest part of writing this book over the last 5 years was making it fun, making it accessible, making it easy to read. And because a lot of the books on organizing tend to be very, very dense, heavy. And I really wanted this to be accessible to just about anybody.
Well, I think you've done it because it was very exciting. And some of the things that are talked about in the book are the out-of-the-box guerrilla activism, thinking and act, that the activists took. Talk about one of your favorites, and then the impact that these refreshing and surprising tactics had at the time.
Mm-hmm. I would say probably one of the most fun and intense experiences was the Clooney counterparty.
No, I was hoping you were going to say that.
Yeah, so the Clooney counterparty. There was an action in LA called Occupy CNN. And at the Occupy CNN action, where we had about 2,000 people who surrounded CNN protesting the Bernie blackout, or the lack of media coverage and unfair media coverage of the Bernie Sanders campaign, which was even that action even got uplifted by Bill Maher on his show. So it actually was pretty effective. But at that, there was a man whose family owned the 99-cent stores, the 99 cents only stores. And he just happened to say, hey, I live next door to George Clooney, who was hosting a $33,000 per plate fundraiser for Hillary Clinton. And so he basically allowed us to hold a 99% party, which we did in the branding of the 99-cent stores, next door to Hillary Clinton's $33,000 a plate party. And when the motorcade drove by, we had about 200 people outside. We were organizing against Secret Service, which presents complications, and they did actually try to bait us into, at one point, a Secret Serviceman grabbed a woman from one of the side and dragged her across the street. But then when the motorcade drove by, we threw $1,000 in the air, which was a tactic that was used by, Abby Hoffman at Wall Street directly. It was also used against the FIFA president to protest their corruption. And then the news networks just went bananas for it. And we became the sort of stupid thing of the week. And then they went into overdrive. The mainstream news went into overdrive trying to claim that we were misogynists, even though most of our organizers were women. And that we were trying to make it rain.
You were right.
So that was one of my favorite ones, because it did literally get international news.
You can tell you've really made an impact when the mainstream media and the forces of corporatism are just so outraged that they have to talk about it for weeks and really make sure that they have washed the brains of anyone watching, lest they should think, hey, actually a $27 a plate, I think you said in your book, fundraiser for Bernie right next door to this, millions, whatever it was, dollars a plate for Hillary. It really makes the point, and they can't have that point made, apparently.
And the best part about it was George Clooney came on Meet the Press and basically said we were right. And he's like, whoa, wait a minute. Y'all are proud. Yes. So they didn't really expect their fundraiser to get any media attention, really. And so we were able to elevate that. And it was pretty crazy. And they did have assault rifles pointed at us as we threw projectiles into her motorcade. So that was pretty crazy. And so when people say that the mainstream media is lying, I actually have the direct experience, because our intention was to elevate the fact that she sold billions of dollars in weapons, commercial weapons, to brutal dictatorships in return for tens of millions of dollars to the Clinton Global Initiative. And also, the regime change wars, the failed state she created in Libya. That was one of our intentions, was to try to uplift that as well as the obscene money in politics. And when the motorcade drove by, we were playing Rosemary Clooney, George Clooney's aunt. We're in the money. So I went to Dan Merica, one of the CNN reporters. I was like, "Hi, I'm one of the organizers. Would you like to know why we're doing this?" And he looked at me as he was filming, and without missing a beat, went, "Not really."
No.
And then they proceeded to play the footage without the music. I don't know. I actually, I don't frequent those establishments, those where women dance. But I can imagine that nobody is playing Rosemary Clooney's "We're in the Money" at those establishments.
Probably not. I
think
that's a safe bet, Jay.
Yeah.
Well, the book has a lot of examples of this kind of out-of-the-box, exciting stuff that the movement did, and it gained a lot of media attention. Sometimes, the corporate media narrative suggests that, well, first of all, it twisted everything in the moment, but it's still suggesting that Occupy Wall Street didn't achieve much. Talk about what they are missing.
Well, in my opinion, what they're missing is that, number one, Occupy Wall Street got people out of the house, got out from behind the keyboard, and it had people challenge the hegemony of the corporate state. And that was no small thing. It was a vibrant center for ideas, for new ideas. And a lot of people like myself, I've been community organizing for years, but I was not very grounded in any kind of leftist theory. So in terms of a political awakening, it was an incredible moment. Also, it fundamentally reshaped the national conversation in Overton window around money in politics and wealth inequality, as well as the 2008 crisis, where no one went to jail, even though they defrauded the American economy, left millions of people upside down on their mortgages or homeless, and really destroyed lives. And it was due to fraud. And aside from that, there were a whole lot of movements that came out of that,
including actTV.
Including actTV, like OG, the founders of actTV, and all y'all were day one occupiers in Zuccotti Park. And
I didn't sleep there. I'm sorry to tell you, because I lived so close. I figured, I could. Anyway, not my personal
in my
story.
opinion, if you showed up, you're an occupier. That's I don't think we need to qualify. But it was a really powerful moment. Movements like the Fight for 15, and specifically the next iteration was the Bernie Sanders movement, which was a direct manifestation of Occupy Wall Street organizing efforts. A small group of occupiers got together, saw the writing on the wall that Hillary Clinton would be the obvious presumptive nominee, and that should not go unanswered. And so literally organized to mobilize the Occupy network and push Bernie to run. Really super important. A lot of those groups, those affinity groups for Bernie Sanders in various cities, the ADA groups for Bernie, in different cities. A lot of that came out of this Occupy effort called the 99 events for the 99% for the people for Bernie Sanders. And the Bernie campaign would not have happened. He would not have run if he hadn't seen that there was such enthusiasm on the ground, and activists directly following him around the country, asking him, Bernie, are you going to run? And out of some of those became central players in the campaign. Others became players in the movement. So Occupy Wall Street's, basically they tried to bury us, but they didn't realize we were seeds. And a lot of us continued to, we continued to organize to this very day. And Occupy brought us all together. The internet allowed, there were groups like Inter-Occupy, there were Tech Ops. There were, it was one of the first times we leftists were really able to use the internet to create an enormous mobilization.
Jay, it's funny that you said that that it brought us all together, because I do remember the vibe of the encampments. It was solidarity, it was love, it was sharing, it was support. It was nice, even when the leftists were fighting about like Trotskyism versus whatever, when they were having discussions. It's interesting that we're all stuck back in our homes behind our keyboards again at this point, because of the pandemic. Your thoughts about how we can overcome the isolation of what's happened over the last year?
Well, I am really glad you asked that, because there are going to be events. So if you are in Boston or New York or Los Angeles, we are getting together for some in-person, safe, socially distanced events to celebrate and commemorate the 10th anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. And in my opinion, the path forward really is about, and I'm not alone in thinking this, we've learned a lot since Occupy Wall Street. For a lot of us, myself, I'll speak for myself, I wasn't that, for a lot of us, we learned that you need to build inside and outside power. Right. So you can't just sit outside of a building with a bullhorn and expect your stakeholders to care. But a lot of us in the, and I only speak for myself really, but a lot of us who are organizing this 10th anniversary recognize that we're in a moment where we must act out of solidarity, recognizing intersectionality, bringing the movements for racial justice, climate justice, health justice, unhoused justice, undocumented justice, LGBTQIA justice, and now, of course, gender justice with the Texas Taliban, basically overturning Roe v. Wade, which is mind-boggling. But in my opinion, we have to get out of our silos. We have to break down our mental silos that these issues are separate, and to get back to that moment remember that moment in Occupy when everything seemed possible and we were the 99%.
You know, I asked my students at the time I was teaching media studies at Brooklyn College. We were talking about Occupy and the coverage of Occupy. And I just said, okay, I want you all to go. I gave them the day off of class and I said, go and then report back on what you saw. And they were just all blown away because there is no way to really it's hard to put into words the experience of being there and interacting with people on that level.
Yeah, agreed. It's hard. And I tried the best I could to capture some of the feeling in the book of some of these moments.
Oh, you totally did.
But it's really like, it's impossible. It's one of the things, like at a certain point, it's great that people are uplifting things on social media. They're commentating that people are creating YouTube channels. All this is very good. And it's not the same as getting out from behind your keyboard and showing up.
Jay, I've heard you refer to supporting Bernie Sanders as the most important tactic for the movement, right? Taking that right from your book. At the time of the encampment in Zuccotti Park, there was quite a bit of disagreement between different factions, some of whom believe that pushing from within the system was not the way to go. Your thoughts on that debate, given what's happened in the last 10 years?
Well, I think in terms of praxis, or having a viable theory of change that actually works, time and time again, what's been borne out is an inside-outside strategy. It's not enough to work from within the system because the system itself is too corrupt. And a lot of times people who are agents for change, they just get absorbed, when they're in that beltway bubble or wherever it is, whatever structure of power, the party forces are so strong. And conversely, the outside power alone is not a viable theory of change, even though it does make an enormous difference. The movement for Black Lives has made an enormous impact on the fabric of our country. And I will say that a lot of the most powerful instances of systemic change come when outside activists are working with people who are directly, collectively bargaining with inside agents, using the power of the grassroots to specifically leverage that for policy changes. So basically, you need to have some kind of dialogue, some kind of meaningful dialogue with the stakeholders of whatever you're trying to target, whether it's a corporation or a government of some kind. And they have to be afraid of the numbers that we mobilize. And this isn't anything that the NRA hasn't been doing or the Christian right has been doing very effectively since forever, right? So it's what the Slick did to pass the Voting Act. They Martin Luther King and the leaders of the civil rights movement were in direct dialogue with Lyndon Johnson, and he was a Southern racist. I mean,
Jay, we have just a few minutes here, and before Noam Chomsky comes on, and you get to talk with him. But I really do want to get your thoughts on the following few questions. So, one is, do you think Elizabeth Warren regrets that she kind of blew off the Ready for Warren campaign, which was in a way the precursor to the push to elect Bernie Sanders? The movement was moving to support Elizabeth Warren first, and then she was like, no, and then everyone moved to Bernie. Your thoughts about her?
Well, I can't speak to what is in her mind, so I'm not sure what is in her mind, but I can say that I think that the People for Bernie's first tactic was Elizabeth Warren. It made sense on a lot of levels. She had supported Occupy Wall Street, and she told those organizers directly that there was I think at one point she told one of them, leave me alone. There's no way I'm going to do this. And what I can say is that I believe that if Elizabeth Warren had stepped up to take on the Clinton machine, she would have received just as much support as Bernie Sanders did. I know I would have. I can speak for myself, but there would have been enormous enthusiasm. I think that history shows, where people's true solidarity lies at the end. So, we'll leave others to judge for themselves.
Sure. Your book is really an insider's guide to what happened in the trenches in Bernie 2020 and before. Has the movement kind of put all its eggs in one basket? I mean, Bernie can't go on kind of forever. I know his movement was, the not me, us. What's the next play here?
Well, in my opinion, first off, like, it's really important to distinguish that, for organizers, Bernie was a tactic. It was a strategy, so, and that campaign brought together even more of these organizers across the country. There's an entire, and yeah, you're not going to hear about this on corporate news, but there's a vibrant movement of people and organizers and activists who now know each other. We've built our own media structures and ways to message the movement. But I really do think, in light of the IPCC report, we really need to take our organizing to another level, because we have 8 years to go carbon neutral if we are going to have anything resembling a functional civilization. So for me, climate is very centered, but at the same time, 60,000 people a year die because they have lack of healthcare. In my opinion, the path forward is to break down the silos, is for us to get out of our own bubble and start coming together to really create big, broad coalitions with the strategies that can push this administration to take some meaningful action. I mean, Biden is they're a Democratic supermajority in California is greenlighting new fossil fuel projects.
Yeah, I saw that.
Let that sink in, right? No. Biden running on climate, doing the opposite, the opposite. So this is nothing new for us, but I actually think that this is a moment where we really need to have a come to Jesus moment and really get out of our own way, get out of our comfort zones, and really, above all, remember that Occupy spirit and come together. So I hope everybody comes out on September 17th and 18th. There's a link tree that has a bunch of events on it, or start your own. That's the thing about Occupy.
Yeah, just go out with a sign and make
go out with it. Get a bunch of your friends together. actTV is going to be live streaming on the day.
True.
And so please tune into that, and remember, this is your movement.
Jay Ponti, activist and founder of Be the Revolution. Jay, the title of the new book and when it's coming out.
So it's called Be the Revolution: How Occupy Wall Street and the Bernie Sanders Movement Reshaped American Politics. And it should be out before Thanksgiving. We're in the last round of edits.
Looking forward to that. I've had the pleasure of reading the first run, and it was really a page turner. Coming up next on the show, Jay will be having a conversation with author, professor, activist Noam Chomsky. Jay, are you excited to be talking with such a hero of the left?
I am a fanboy. I'm not going to lie. He is probably my number one influence intellectually, and one of my absolute heroes. So I'm incredibly honored to have the opportunity to talk to Professor Chomsky.
We look forward to hearing your conversation and are happy you're doing it here on actTV. Stay with us.
Well, you're our people. So, and thank you for all your work, Julianna. And you have quite a good interview with him as well. So people should go and
you can catch that. And we'll be playing parts of that on the 17th as well. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to actTV. And it is my profound honor today to welcome American linguist, cognitive scientist, historian, political activist. He's sometimes called the father of modern linguistics, Professor Noam Chomsky. He has written 150 books on topics like war, politics, mass media, and he is sometimes known as the founder of cognitive science. Welcome, Professor Noam Chomsky.
Pleased to be with you.
It is really such an honor. You have been such an influence on me personally. Your activism, your writing, the way you think, the way you so clearly have been able to deconstruct a very complicated society and government. So I just want to thank you for your entire legacy, which has had an absolute profound impact on me. One of the reasons that we're talking today is that September 17th is indeed the 10th anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. So I wanted to know from your perspective, what was the importance of Occupy Wall Street then? What is its relevance today? And especially in light of, say, the new IPCC report, which is telling us that we have roughly 8 years to go carbon neutral or carbon negative.
Well, I should start by saying that the success of the Occupy movement, which was quite remarkable, was a surprise to me, a very pleasant surprise. I hadn't anticipated anything like that, but it somehow captured the needs of the moment perfectly, spread like wildfire. I was traveling a lot at the time. I was giving talks to Occupy groups in Australia, London, Boston, where I was living, other places. Enthusiastic, big crowds. Occupy was, of course, a tactic. It's not a permanent strategy. And the tactic dramatically succeeded in two respects. One, it changed discourse and consciousness pretty much around the world. It was astonishing. There had been very little talk about, concern about inequality until then. I mean, people knew it existed, but it was not a major issue. Occupy put it right in the center of attention. The 99%, 1% became an understandable slogan everywhere. Everyone could understand we're part of the 99%. Look what's happening to the 1% and to us. I mean, it was sort of people were aware of it before, but this moved it really to the center of consciousness and attention. That was the immediate dramatic effect. The longer term effect, I think, was multiple. For one thing, for the participants themselves, it was a tremendous experience. It created a generation of activists, people who had gained a sense that we can work together in solidarity with mutual aid to achieve goals that are essential. And apart from the individuals, as you discuss in your book, in fact, it had great consequences leading all the way to the Sanders campaign, which was unthought of at the time. As you point out, he never considered it himself to be an option. And it turned into one of maybe the greatest political success in American history. It's pretty amazing.
And yet, the mainstream media had a different narrative.
It was interesting. During the whole first campaign, they simply either ignored him or ridiculed him. Second campaign, pretty much as well. But he ended the first campaign as the most popular political figure in the country. That's pretty hard to ignore. Mm-hmm. Well, they did continue to ignore it. There was no coverage of his huge town hall meetings, his positions. The media and the Democratic National Committee, the Clintonite party managers, did everything they could to try to undermine and suppress the campaign, but they couldn't manage it. He managed to break with over a century of American political history. I mean, I don't have to tell you, as you know better than I do, that in the United States electoral system, electability is basically bought. Elections are bought. You can predict electability with remarkable precision just by looking at things like campaign spending. Tom Ferguson is the person who's done the major work on that. For Congress, it's almost a straight line kind of result you'd rarely get in the social sciences. And Sanders managed to come within a hairbreadth of winning the election with no corporate support, no support from the wealthy, no support, in fact, ridicule from the media. but it worked. And
What's
now
so
he's in a
interesting,
powerful position.
and what's so interesting to me is I remember so clearly the conversation always being centered around, well, how much money have they raised, right? And for the first, and Bernie Sanders, without a super PAC and without corporate sponsors, smashed every single campaign fundraising record for a presidential campaign in a primary. He out fundraised President Obama in the general, in the primary, with small dollar individual donations. And all of a sudden, we didn't hear about that.
Yeah, that's
Why is that?
Well, that I think can be traced in substantial measure to the mobilization engagement that was significantly amplified by the Occupy campaign, the Occupy events and their long-term aftermath. Well, getting to the IPCC report, it was the most dire of the reports, the periodic reports that they've issued. It basically said that we have a few years in which we can somehow mitigate, control the ongoing, increasing threat of environmental catastrophe. If we fail on this, it's not that everybody's going to die tomorrow, but we'll reach irreversible tipping points where nothing much can be done, just waiting for the collapse of any kind of organized social life on Earth. That's as powerful as it is. No, it's worth looking at what happened the day after the IPCC report. The day after the report, Joe Biden addressed the OPEC, the main oil cartel, and pleaded with them to increase oil production so as to lower gas prices in the United States, which would improve his electoral prospects. So on Monday, we hear a warning, a highly credible warning, inescapable warning, that we're heading off a precipice. And if we don't do something about it quickly, we will fall. The next day, you hear the president of the most powerful country in the world saying, let's race to the precipice. Was there any commentary on this? If there was, afraid I missed it. It's a kind of a suicidal blindness, not total by any means. It varies. Among Republicans, it's a pathology. Recent polls I've seen about, there was one recent poll by Pew Research Center, major research center, and they asked people, they gave people a list of, I think, 15 serious problems, asked them to rank them in urgency. Among Republicans, the lowest on the list, 14%, was climate change, the lowest. Highest on the list was the federal debt and illegal immigrants. I mean, this is serious pathology. Among the Democrats, it wasn't marvelous, but at least it was approaching sanity. Unless this is changed, and significantly, the future of the human species is not very bright.
So what is that, in your opinion? I've heard you speak on atomization, the word atomization, and how Occupy Wall Street got people out of the house. In light of this moment, can you talk a little bit about the import of the 10th anniversary and this moment we're facing as a civilization?
The atomization is very real. Partly it's explicitly planned. You may remember when the neoliberal plague took off 40 years ago, the slogans were, "There is no society, only individuals. Government is the problem. The solution, which wasn't said, is to hand power over to private concentrations of wealth, tyrannies who will run the world for their own benefit. That's the solution. It's called neoliberalism. But crucially, there is no society. You're alone, facing the ravages of the market without help. You're looking out for yourself, don't care about anyone else. You're alone, atomized." Margaret Thatcher, who produced that phrase, was surely unaware that she was paraphrasing Karl Marx. Marx bitterly condemned the autocratic rulers of his day for wanting to turn the population into what he called a sack of potatoes, atomized individuals, isolated, unable to work together in solidarity to achieve the goals that are necessary for the common good. Well, the slogan of neoliberalism. Occupy was able to break that pattern. 10th anniversary, we should remember that achievement. Working together, we can achieve a lot. We can stop the doomsday clock from reaching midnight, where it's heading, now 100 seconds away. Gave up minutes during the Trump years. Okay, you can reverse that. Not alone, only by acting together. We've seen that here. Take Sunrise Movement. Young activists working really hard on doing something about the looming environmental catastrophe, got to the point of occupying congressional offices, Nancy Pelosi's office. Ordinarily, they just would have been kicked out by the Capitol Police. Not this time. They had popular support. They had support from young representatives who came in on the Sanders wave, especially Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She was able to pick up support from senior Democrat Ed Markey, who's been interested in environmental issues all his life. Two of them. This compelled the Biden campaign to put on paper a moderately reasonable climate program. Not enough, but better than anything that preceded. We don't have internal documents, but I was following the Democratic Party webpage in the period leading up to the election. Up through about August, when you looked up Democratic program on climate change, you got Biden's program. Then it disappeared, replaced by how to contribute to the Democratic Party. I think it's a fair guess that there was a struggle going on inside, and the party managers succeeded in killing it. Well, it's still there. Ocasio-Cortez and Markey have introduced a resolution, not legislation, but a resolution, which is very good. It's approximately the same as what the International Energy Agency produced, feasible, fairly comprehensive set of detailed policies to try to address the looming catastrophe. Has to be moved from resolution to legislation, then implemented. Not implemented by someone who says, it's a great program, OPEC, please increase oil production. No, that has to be stopped fast. Not much time. The COP26 conference is coming up in Glasgow in a couple of weeks. This is a time for intensive activism to make sure that to hold their feet to the fire, many governments participating, so they don't come out just with pleasant words or greenwashing, but with actual concrete proposals to sharply restrict production of petroleum, beginning now, fixed percentage every year, till we reach essentially zero production, limited amounts. It's okay. Has to be done and done fast.
Yeah, it's interesting. To me, this is like the part in the movie where the big scary aliens come and the entire world comes together to do something and overcome it. And yet people are still debating whether or not this is existing. And when you're talking about the effects coming down the road, I couldn't help but think of the people in Texas who suffered that cold snap and were left. And I think I would love to get into talking about your book, The Precipice, Neoliberalism, the Pandemic, and the Urgent Need for Social Change. But I couldn't help but think of the people in Texas who were left to fend for themselves in the midst of that. And also thinking about the people who perished in many of the Camp Fires, the Thomas Fires, these incredible wildfires that are only continuing to escalate. But I would love to hear, vis-a-vis your book, your thoughts on that.
It's a pretty astonishing phenomenon. It goes all the way to the top. Take the pandemic. Serious problem, very serious. Not on the scale of environmental destruction, but very serious. What you see right now is the rich countries pretty much monopolizing the vaccine, defending the rights of pharmaceutical corporations to control the ridiculously exorbitant patents handed to them on a plate by the Clinton and others who created the World Trade Organization rules, patent rights that are not only exorbitant, but way beyond anything in the past, not only for products, but even for processes. Actually, I should say that Europe is even worse than us on this issue. The leadership is defending the rights of big pharma to huge profits from drugs which substantially were produced on the basis of research in the public sector, not entirely, but quite substantially, not only maintaining the product for themselves, but even the process of manufacture to prevent people elsewhere in the world where there are pharmaceutical industries, India, South Africa, others, to produce masses of vaccines, to say the unspeakable. Cuba, which has an advanced pharmaceutical industry, should be in the forefront of this. But to say these words in the United States is like talking Tagalog to a monolingual Swahili speaker. This is fanatic religious doctrine in the United States that we must crush Cuba. Okay, but assuming an element of rationality, we should be both lauding and contributing to their efforts to create a people's vaccine. Those are the things we should be doing. Instead, they're monopolizing it, protecting big pharma, and doing it in the certain knowledge that it's not only killing many people, but it's going to kill them. It's going to come right back and harm them. You leave more time for the virus to mutate, it'll come with other variants, just as Delta did. Now, Mu is coming along. We don't know what will be next. But sooner or later, there could well be one which will resist any form of vaccination we know of. We can be back to a catastrophe like the epidemic 100 years ago, knowing that they still continue to monopolize it. Now that's the people who are supposed to be responsible, the intelligent guys, okay? Something that's really hard to come to terms with. Even worse on climate change, where the disaster is overwhelming. And you have lighthearted views about, don't worry, don't be too upset about it. We've dealt with problems in the past. Technological change has come along. Kind of reminds me of a joke about a guy who's falling off a 100-story skyscraper, and he waves to people on the 50th floor and says, don't worry, everything's worked out so far. It's very much like that. This is it really has to be overcome from the grassroots and up until those who are designated as leaders, though they're not the ones who should be.
And I think that it's one of the things that we learned in Occupy and Bernie and those who came into the Bernie Sanders movement, participated in that, is that there is no one coming to save us. And that if we are going to make these changes, we have to fight. We have to come together and we have to fight. I understand, you know, for those of us who are involved in Occupy Wall Street, our experience with coming into Bernie 2016 and 2020 was a little different than those who just got into grassroots activism at that time. But you have, in many ways, you have been the conscience, the moral witness, the memory of the left. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts in terms of the long view you've had. What advice would you have for young people and those who would stand together today, having been involved in the Vietnam War struggle, you know, having been arrested yourself? You have been you haven't just been, you know, in the academic intelligentsia. You have been in the trenches. You've been arrested. I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. What advice would you have? What counsel would you have giving the long view of history?
Well, there's been plenty of activism over my 90 plus years, old enough to remember the Depression, different forms, many successes, lots of regression. Back in the 1930s, starting from there, my own family was, for extended family, first generation immigrants, working class, mostly unemployed, very hopeful, not like today. No deaths from despair, no opioid epidemic. They were hopeful about the future. It was much worse than today objectively, but there was a rising labor movement, militant labor actions, reasonably sympathetic administration, bitter business opposition, but it was overcome. Many achievements, many which we are benefiting from still today. And there was a sense that if we get together, we work together, we can overcome this. The labor movement wasn't just labor actions. It was cultural programs, a week in the country at the Ilgu camp for my unemployed seamstress aunts, Shakespeare plays, pretty high level, quite a high level of high culture, I should say, just common coin among working people, many of whom barely went to school, didn't graduate elementary school. But there was a sense you can work together and make it. And it achieved quite a lot. We're still living on that legacy. Well, there was a bitter business reaction on hold during the war, came out in force right after the war. relentless, fighting a bitter class war without cease. By the late 70s, early 80s, they managed to succeed in retaking enormous power, and there's been tremendous regression since then. But there were achievements. Take the civil rights movement. Who was that? Well, the name that comes to mind is Martin Luther King, certainly a person of great merit, should be respected for his courage, his integrity, his leadership. But I'm sure he would have been the first to say that he was riding a wave, that the work was being done by people on the ground, black, mostly in the black community, who've been organizing and active for years. By the couple of young kids in Greensboro, North Carolina, who decided to sit in at a segregated lunch counter. Black kids thrown out, arrested, thrown out. Could have been the end of it, except that more came the next day. Pretty soon more came. Pretty soon some young white people came down from the South. Pretty soon you had freedom buses riding through the South, mostly SNCC workers, trying to encourage a poor black farmer in Alabama to take his life in his hand and go to a voting booth and take his life in his hand, literally, take their lives in their hands, the organizers. Okay, finally led to major popular movement, which did have partial achievements, partial but significant. Feminist movement came along later, started with small consciousness raising groups, a couple of women saying, why do we have to live like this? Okay, led to a major popular movement which changed the culture and the society quite significantly. On to others, the environmental movement, right up to the present. The lessons are pretty clear. Get together, make a realistic assessment of existing circumstances. Don't commit yourself to idle, pointless dreams. We live in this world, not some imagined world. We can and should imagine a different world and work towards it, but also recognize, here's this one, going to have to deal with it the way it is. So take, say, the environment. Capitalism is basically a death sentence. It's based on principles which are suicidal. So suppose you say, let's get rid of capitalism and deal with the environmental crisis. Sounds nice. And then if you look at relevant time frames, it's not in the cards. The possible time frame for moving towards a social order that's based on the common good, on need, on what people should have, instead of on profit for the very few and domination of workers in the workplace. It's not going to come within the time frame necessary to overcome this immediate crisis. That's something we just have to face. Doesn't mean you should stop working for the long-term change, not in the least. Groups like the Systems Project, others are working to try to create elements of a more decent society within this one. Worker-owned enterprises, cooperatives, localist initiatives, plenty of things. Also the mass popular organizations. But you have to face reality. We're not going to have a revolution tomorrow. If there is a revolution tomorrow, it'll be a fascist revolution. Guys with the guns move to the arena of violent conflict. They're going to win, not us. We have power, but elsewhere. So you have to understand all this. Don't be discouraged. plenty of the historical sense shows you that there are many victories under much harsher circumstances than what we face. We do face problems of a level that have never existed in human history. We don't have much time to solve them. The means are available, it's feasible, there are good plans, there are even steps forward. So, for example, take West Virginia, coal country. The workers in coal country have plenty of reason to be bitter and angry. Their lives are being destroyed by the end of the coal economy. It's not a joke. It doesn't have to be that way. There are clear, good programs to move them, to help them transfer to a much better form of life, better jobs, better communities, not the brutal conditions of the mines, not black lung disease. And furthermore, there are steps being taken towards it. Activists like my colleague Bob Pollan have been working with unions. United Mine Workers in West Virginia has now moved to working on a transition program from coal mines, which have got to disappear if we're going to survive, to better jobs and better communities and better work. All of this is happening, can be intensified, can lead to a revived labor movement. A little more memory is helpful. The first serious environmentalists were the Union of Oil Atomic Workers, the union in which Tony Mazzocchi was a leading figure, a radical union organizer and a leading environmentalist back in the early 70s. Those are the people who are on the front line on environmental issues. They're the ones who are dying from the pollution and the destructive character of oil, gas, coal, atomic production. So they were in the lead. That's where you get initiatives like OSHA and others. Mazzocchi went on to try to form a labor party in the 1990s. Party aimed at radically changing capitalist oppression and dealing directly with the serious crises. Well, couldn't make it then. Maybe you can now. These are all possibilities. And the labor movement, a revived labor movement, should again be at the center of it.
And we'd be remiss to not mention that we're filming this today on Labor Day, which is pretty extraordinary to be speaking with you, Noam, on Labor Day. But what's interesting to me is that labor today has and of course, people take for granted the fact that you mentioned OSHA, that there is OSHA today, and there is a 40-hour work week, and there is overtime, and there is benefits, and there is a living wage, and children are not working in factories or coal mines, and people take that for granted, that those were hard won. And yet today, labor has not been behind any of the progressive victories like AOC or Tiffany Caban or Cori Bush largely. How can you comment on how the left can change labor? How can we reinvigorate our relationship with labor? And why isn't labor today the progressive force that it was in the past?
Well, unfortunately, this goes back a long way. After the Second World War, the more militant, energetic, activist elements of the labor movement were mostly expelled under McCarthyite hysteria, which the labor movement did go along with, expelled many of the militant leaders. The labor leadership then entered into a compact with business, saying, Okay, we'll hand you control of the shop floor, control of the workplace, and in return, you give us fairly decent wages, health programs. We can then go on individually and enter middle class life. That's a fool's compact. You don't make a compact with your class enemy. And that was learned, but too late. During the Carter years, Jimmy Carter, who was a conservative Democrat, Doug Fraser, head of the UAW, resigned from a Carter-initiated labor management program, this is 1978, with a bitter, angry speech in which he sharply condemned the business world for breaking the compact and fighting what he said was a one-sided class war against working people, the poor, the middle classes. Nice insight, except they're always fighting a class war, relentlessly, always. If it's one-sided, it's because you're not participating. Okay, it was a little late. Then came along Ronald Reagan, bitterly anti-labor, bitterly racist. First move, also Thatcher's in England, first move to destroy the labor movement, the only organized force that could defend working people against the neoliberal onslaught that was planned, which has been one we should recognize of extraordinary robbery of the poor and the middle classes. Extraordinary. This is recognized right at the center of power. You've probably seen the Rand Corporation study. Can't be more respectable than the Rand Corporation. Did a major study a couple months ago on what they called the transfer of wealth, what we should call highway robbery. Transfer of wealth from the lower 90% of the population, the working class, middle class, to the top fraction of 1%. Well, their estimate is about $50 trillion during the neoliberal years, which is a very serious underestimate. Doesn't account all sorts of other things that Reagan opened up for robbery, tax havens, shell companies, all massive devices. Huge robbery. Meanwhile, once Reagan opened the doors to illegal breaking of strikes using scabs, business got the word, they turned to it. Now you have major companies dedicated to sophisticated techniques of strike breaking. Just saw it in the Amazon strike. Plenty of money going into it, plenty of work. Clinton helped out by designing NAFTA so that it would undermine working people in the United States. Didn't have to happen that way. Labor had a different view, which was dismissed. Just Clinton even opened the door to illegal strike breaking. Study. Kate Bronfenbrenner, labor historian, did a study under NAFTA rules, which found that, forget the exact number, maybe as much as 50% of strikes, of organizing efforts, were broken by illegal acts of business threatening to move the enterprise to Mexico if they continued organizing. Of course, they were never going to do it, but the threat suffices. Well, of course, that's illegal under labor law. It doesn't matter if there's a criminal state which doesn't enforce the laws. We've seen that right up till today. So major assault on labor. They allowed business to fight a one-sided class war too long, have to reconstitute. It's happening in interesting ways, often outside the official labor movement, like the teacher strikes in West Virginia and Arizona, not the most liberal states in the country, outside the union framework, got enormous public support. I live in Arizona. I mean, in Tucson, where I live, drove around, there were signs on lawns all over the place supporting the teachers. Not just better wages, which they need, but to reverse the attack on the public education system. Part of the neoliberal assault has been to undermine public education all the way up to the college level, defund colleges, defund public schools, make sure that you have ignorance, not conformity. Kind of reminds me of a fascist slogan, one of General Franco's favorite generals back in 1936 proclaimed in Spanish, death to intelligence, viva death, would be the slogan of Trump Republicans, actually neoliberalism more generally, not in quite as brutal a form. Well, that's what the teachers were fighting for: better classrooms, better facilities, end the attack on the educational system. Struggle goes on. Arizona, enormous public support for more funding for the schools. The Republican legislature votes it down. So these are battles that are going to have to be won at every level: labor, schools. Just take the new Republican tactic, brilliant tactic, of trying to organize poll watchers and election officials. Who cares about that? These are people who show up once a year and look at a poll. Smart. They care about it, because that's one of the ways they can make sure that elections become totally fraudulent. Already, Republicans for a long time have won elections with a minority of the popular vote. They want it to be graven in stone. They know they're a minority party. They're losing demographically. White supremacists are declining. That's part of the population. Can't hold the finger in the dike forever, but they can try by just making sure that polls are even more fraudulent than they are now. Not just corporate money coming in, structural advantages of rural conservative America, the ludicrous character of the Senate with a radically anti-democratic character. With all of that, make sure that we can intimidate election watchers and put in our own people who manage somehow to make the voting even less representative of the country than it is now. Well,
so I can't, as you're talking about all this, I can't help but remember how strategic and organized the establishment has been in dismantling a lot of our leftist movements. We saw that when the Occupy camps were dismantled, when you had mayors across the country having conference calls with sheriffs across the country to discuss how specifically they were going to dismantle our movement and occupations. We saw this at Standing Rock. We've seen the intersection of corporate America and the police state and our government officials colluding to derail our movements. We also saw this with the Never Bernie movement, with the neoliberal technocrats in the Center for American Progress and the party working, like having meetings to specifically strategize how they could dismantle our movements. On the other side, you also talk about the fascists. And this is something I also addressed in my book, how QAnon was a very highly coordinated psyop from ex-intelligence people who were working in intelligence, using the tactics that they have studied, that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda have used. They're using that on American citizens to drive these conspiracy theories. But out of all of that, how can you emerge as a leftist or a progressive or someone who just cares about the living and the sustainability of the planet, seeing that we're fighting a war against neoliberalism, we're fighting a war against the technocracy, the corporate state. Well, on the other side, you have a more extreme version of that that is actually fascist. How can we all emerge from that? How do you not just want to shut everything down and watch cat videos?
Well, first of all, we should recognize that it's not new. Go back to the early labor movement, major labor movement in the 19th century, quite radical by our standards. So its slogan was, "Those who work in the mills should own them." Not just, "I want to have a job and a better job." We should run the place. There was a radical populist movement, not populist in the contemporary sense, real populist. U.S. was an agrarian country. Radical farmers in Texas and Kansas and Oklahoma organized to develop what they called a cooperative commonwealth, in which the farmers themselves would be free of the Northeastern bankers who lent them money and then charged usurious rates, ran the marketing system. They would do it themselves in a cooperative commonwealth. Huge popular movement, began to link up with Knights of Labor, the enormous labor movement. Could have made a very different country. Well, it was crushed by just the kind of force that you're describing. Violence, combination of corporate-run militias, famous Pinkertons, state power, National Guards. There were places in Western Pennsylvania, like Homestead, major steel mining area, where the workers were running the towns, crushed by force. Went on with Woodrow Wilson, liberal president, his Red Scare, worst repression in the country's history, smashed the labor movement, among others. By the 1920s, labor movement was almost dead. Revitalized, recouped in the 1930s, became a major force, led the way to the New Deal. Now there's one of the top labor historians, Eric Loomis, has reviewed a lot of this history and pointed out something important. Points out that the labor struggles that succeeded, and there were many, were always with a degree of cooperation, maybe even sympathy from the official elected leadership. That is true at the national level, like Roosevelt, down to the town level. There are towns today where mayors have just refused to implement repressive, violent tactics and have offered space for activism to proceed. Okay, if you have this kind of cooperation, you can make progress. Mainly, it's the activism on the ground, but there has to be enough power to fend off the class warfare carried out by the business classes and state power if they manage to control it, like what you witnessed in Los Angeles when the police came out and smashed everything up. Okay.
Yeah, I got hit in the ribs with a baton, and I'll tell you, that does have a way to shift your worldview leftward. That was quite an awakening. And as we're reaching this moment, you were on the ground during the Vietnam War, and I want to sort of wrap with this. You know, you've seen the left over a long period of time, and you see the left today. Do you have any constructive criticism for the left today?
Should learn the lessons of the past and not repeat them. So take the Vietnam War, anti-war movement in the Vietnam years, which, yes, I was very much involved in. I myself got involved too late in 1961. Should have been 10 years earlier, when Truman, then Eisenhower, escalated the war against South Vietnam. I myself got involved in 61 when John F. Kennedy sharply escalated the war. It was almost impossible. Couldn't talk to anybody about it. Could talk to a couple of people in a living room, maybe. Nobody wanted to hear about it. It wasn't happening. Meanwhile, South Vietnam was being destroyed. I was living in Boston, liberal city. As late as 1966, we couldn't have a public demonstration without it being attacked by counter-demonstrators, broken up, many of them young people, press, liberal press, egging them on, praising them. By that time, South Vietnam had almost been wiped out. Of course, the war had extended to the north and to the rest of Indochina. Finally, by 1967, was a major popular movement, 1967. By 1968 and 69, was already beginning to erode. SDS, which was the major student group, was then breaking up into pretty irrational tendencies. One tendency was becoming Maoists, handing out red books at the gates of General Electric plant. So let's have a revolution. You can imagine how that worked. The other was weathermen. Let's smash windows on Wall Street and get people against the war.
Yeah, the Weather Underground. Yeah.
The Vietnamese were appalled by this. What they wanted is simple, nonviolent tactics. They didn't care whether people in the United States felt that they're carrying out the revolution, which they're not. They cared for their own survival, and they tried hard to implore people to carry out the kind of tactics that would bring, say, construction workers to oppose the war, not to support it, out of anger at what was happening. Well, that lesson was not learned in time. It was effective. The anti-war movement had a major effect. Very likely even stopped Nixon from using nuclear weapons. Fairly good evidence for that. So it had an effect. Could have had a much greater effect. In 1968, young leftists decided they're not going to vote against Nixon because Humphrey is just a corporate liberal, which he was. But he was a corporate liberal. He wasn't Richard Nixon. Might have made a considerable difference. Many corpses might have been spared by biting your tongue and voting against the worst Nixon. Well, wasn't done. That's also a lesson to be learned.
I think we can learn that from Otpor as well in Yugoslavia. Very clearly, they had a tactic to vote out Milosevic, and then, of course, they had to back that up with the bulldozer revolution. But we did see that on the left in a post-Bernie world. Once the Bernie Sanders coalition, which represented a very, very wide range of ideologies that united under that policy vision, and then that sort of dispersed into factionalism. And there's a corner of the left that said, well, we're just not going to participate. I think that Otpor and Milosevic is a good example where when you recognize a danger such as Trump, you cannot claim to be anti-fascist while you let the fascists run a third of the government, in my opinion.
And in fact, that was a very significant component and a dangerous one. I mean, there's this illusion that we're going to sit it out. That's not a choice. When you sit it out, you're helping the worst candidate by depriving the opposition of a vote. That's just arithmetic. Can't argue that. So you're not sitting it out. If you sat out the 2020 election, you were helping Trump win. Okay. Well, it came pretty close. What we have is by no means great. could be a lot worse.
That's right. I think that was one of the biggest lessons myself and many others took away from Occupy, was that just standing outside with a bullhorn, taking prefigurative actions, is you have to actually challenge the structures of power, occupy the structures of power. And doing organizing around the Democratic Party is not an endorsement of the party leadership. It's not an endorsement of the Democratic Party. I am not a Democrat. But many of us, I think, came away from Occupy Wall Street with that understanding that without collective bargaining, without an inside-outside strategy, without building real power, making real systemic change is not possible.
That's true. But it's down to combating the quite clever Republican strategy of even mobilizing poll watchers, taking over school boards, working at the state level where you can achieve quite a lot without much. And that makes a big difference.
Yes.
Doesn't mean endorsing the party and its ideals, like when AOC and Markey put in the resolution on the climate. Don't know about Markey, but for AOC at least, she's not saying, I love the Democratic Party. She's saying, here's something crucial for survival, concrete, that we can push forward within that framework. To say, I'm not going to do it because I want a revolution, is to say, let's destroy ourselves.
Yes, and we have to wrap. And thank you so much for your time, Noam. It's been one of the great honors of my life to have this conversation with you. I mean that authentically. I'm just curious, out of the 150 books, creating an entire branch of science and philosophy, what in your incredible body of work, what have you been most proud of?
It'll surprise you, but the things I can't take pride in participating in, were achieving a goal that seemed utterly impossible, which I was one of a handful of people involved in for 25 years. That was preventing the virtual extermination of the population of East Timor. It's the worst atrocity relative to population since the Holocaust. It looked totally hopeless. I mean, small country of a couple 100,000 poor people trying to resist an invasion by a major power backed strongly by the United States, other Western powers. How can it possibly succeed? Well, amazingly it did. The people who were most responsible for its success aren't going to go down in history. People like Arnold Cohen, who was at the center of organizing for 25 years all over the world, a couple of others. But it did succeed. And saving that kind of achievement is very rare. Not going to go down in history. Who cares, But there are victories like that all over the place. Small victories, but major for the people involved. And,
well, thank you so much for your time, Noam. And I just want to remind people, September 17th and 18th is the 10th anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. If you're in Los Angeles, New York, Boston, there will be events. I would encourage you to get out from behind the computer, go and have your own event. And act.tv will be live streaming events on those days, on that weekend. And moreover, I just want to encourage everybody to go out and realize that there's no one coming to save us. It's us. And it's only through our solidarity and our activism. But I just wanted to say that I am so grateful for this time. Please buy Noam Chomsky's book, The Precipice, Neoliberalism, the Pandemic, and the Urgent Need for Social Change. And I just want to thank you so much for your time, Noam.
Thank you.